Hello everyone, today we talk about the Islamic standards during the Crusade era. We would look at some example, then focusing mostly on the Turkish tug and sanjak, and then concluding with some notes on colors of Islamic banners. So this video partly connects also with the Islamic military music that we made a video of back in the day, the Navba, the Tablakana, etc., the Nakarakana, that were closely connected in the transcendental Islamic symbolism to war. These were very ancient traditions, actually. It would be interesting to look also at the origins of Islamic standards since the beginning, also since pre-Islamic Arabia. The alam is the properly the banner. There were other names, and I'm not sure. Actually, there is a huge documentation. Most of Islamic banners we have today are preserved in museums, also here in the West. They date mostly between the 18th and the 17th and the 18th century, right? Mostly from the Ottoman Empire and North Africa. I mean, for obvious reasons. If you go at the XI-XIII Museum in Vienna, you will find these beautiful banners were taken from the Ottomans in 1683. And naturally, for the Middle Ages, we are less documented, so we partly rely on this rare finds. It's mostly also about symbolism. Today, we will talk actually also about the symbol of the crescent. That is quite important, not just in Islamic symbolism. Also the Byzantines adopted it, but that's something very ancient of Mesopotamian origin, and not all. Right here we could descend. We made a video on Islamic heraldry, mostly the Mamluk one, that was, let's say, the most similar to what was happening in the West. But the topic is huge, right? Because there are important differences between Islamic and Christian cultures, military cultures in this regard, that have to do with symbolism as well. It's not just a matter of different state of documentation. Naturally, about Islamic have much less, because those societies produce less, in a sense, especially in more modern times, to study in the previous ones. But that shows, for example, a big deal of commixtion with this broader area, also beyond the Muslim borders, right? That was, in that sense, especially connected to this, even if you want this tribal, right, aspect. We will see it better with the Turks, that had even Chinese influences, right? The tug, that is also, I don't know, the symbol, the banner of the French Foreign Legion today. Well, that's something that the Turks themselves took seemingly from China itself, and all the symbolism attached. Also the Mongols had it. So we're talking really about a huge topic that here we can't summarize all together. We will just stick to a few examples. So under the Ayyubids and early Mamluks, so we're talking mostly about Egypt. That was, in this sense, the most, the closest, most powerful Islamic entity naturally to the West, and that was also importantly different in nature from the Turkic and Persianized or Persian proper empires, as that were more feudal in character, in a sense, whereas Egypt had something that we can call as a state in the modern, not quite in the modern sense, of course, that didn't exist even in Europe at the time, but still, with traditions that were much more centralized than other areas at this point. Basically, also Spain, the Caliphate of Cordoba, who was disgregating as it had, and it kind of feudalized because of Western influence as well. So about the Ayyubids and the Mamluks, we have today the latter we treat only up to the late 13th century, not beyond. The royal standard was of gold embroidered yellow silk or damask. The main color is yellow in these standards. And the royal Mamluk units also carried yellow standards, each one embroidered with the heraldic device of its unit commander. And that reveals you also in this state how important the individuality of commander really was. Jean de Joinville, that participated to St. Louis crusade in Egypt, records these devices to have been in crimson, mentioning roses, so-called bends and birds as example. In fact, actually, the Mamluk standard, the Ayyubid standards did have also figures of eagles, etc. You'll see it better later. And this practice may also be intended by a remark in the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi that talks about Richard the First Crusade in the Near East. This work states that at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, Taqi ad-Din commanded 700 of Saladin's Mamluks, each unit of which carried a yellow standard together with a pennon, or the device. We don't, here the translation may be open to interpretation, of a different color. And especially since this source also refers to the use of emblems on standards, and the Itinerarium describes Taqi's own standard as a pair of trousers. And this is also fascinating. I haven't found enough information about this, but the fact that in Islam, yellow is, generally speaking, attached to some negative character. I mean, it does have some, it's usually attached to vegetation. There are also some cows that Moses sacrifices that are, connected to the color, but it's mostly an ambiguous colored one of hell sometimes. Probably the negativity stems from the idea of aging, the idea of, plants passing from green to yellow in a process of decadence. It was often also associated to prostitutes, to concubines, and it was explicitly forbidden in certain areas of Islam at the time to be worn, for example, by men. So it would be interesting, given the nature of Ayyubid and Mamluk power that, as you know, was kind of a bit exotic, for coming from this literally had been previously servile slave soldiers dynasties that of course rose to dramatic power and were sometimes naturally even the Mamluks proper of these armies more powerful than freemen themselves, but the same might have brought with itself a tradition, a legacy from other cultural areas that I really don't know, but it's still meaningful because it's connected. Yellow was kind of the standard color, the official color of the Mamluks as well. Also green in part, that as we will see it's a symbol of paradise in Islam. But anyhow, aside from this, the aforementioned source, the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi, mentions banners and pennants of countless shapes and sizes for Islamic armies, and at this point other sources noting many different colors in use, and naturally we can't think that things differed dramatically from the West, albeit it seems that here, let's say Eastern armies in general, not just the Islamic ones, this is true in part also for, the Mongols, etc., might have made a more, let's say, scientific use of colors, banners, sounds, etc., than in the West, that is traditionally seen as less colorful, less noisy, but it's also myth in part. But for the simple fact that in Eastern armies there was much more cavalry to employ, much more coordination at that point to be in this whirlwinds, let's say, of horsemen, etc. They had to move all at the same, with crystalline coordination. The Mongols were especially famous for their drill, for the fact that they moved all at once with just perfect timing and synchronization. So it is possible that these pennants would have a great banners had a greater importance in Muslim armies, especially among cavalry. But this is just my take on it. Imad ad-Din records red, as well as literally jasmine standards in Saladin's army at the Battle of Hattin. We made a pretty long video about the battle. I don't think we mentioned quite banners or something like that. I don't remember details about it, but still it's meaningful to be reminded. While green standards are recorded in the Seljuk army at the Battle of Dorylium in 1097. More of the Seljuks later. The Abbasid caliphs kept using the traditional black standard up until the destruction of the caliphate at the hands of the Mongols in 1258 that razed Baghdad to the ground. Albeit in 1057 we have knowledge of purple banners decorated with gold script. And in 1171 the Abbasid Caliph sent black banners to both Saladin and Nur ed-Din. Predictably enough, most of the known banners from the Crusading era, Islamic armies date to the 13th century. We know that some of these standards contain properly heraldic symbolism, and as we've seen, this is especially happened in Egypt, where there was a more definite, let's say, identification of certain. More than that's the stability of certain units and their importance also within the state. As we will see, the Turks mostly had their horsetail banners, and this similar designs might have actually been carried by many Mamluk units of steppe origin, as well as we've seen by the Seljuks and the Turkomans. The Fatimid Vizier al-Afdal standard at Ascalon in 1099 was described as having a golden bowl atop a silver-plated staff, which probably was a simple banner, while the Khwarezmian lances recorded by Jean de Joinville were fashioned as, quote, heads with hair that seemed like the heads of devils. We can think of some totemic symbolism in there. The Khwarezmians were kind of especially in the Crusaders context, let's say, some of the most radically properly equestrian cultures in the world picture, in a feudal, kind of properly chivalric. It's difficult to stress, but say the Khwarezmians were the depositories also some of very important steppes traditions, as far as the power of military glory and the descending through music to the drums, and we have seen it in the Islamic military music video, and these lances might have in fact contained, because at the end of the day this was the point, the banners contained an actual magic power, right, such as music and other symbols. Same swords, right? This is true also in the West, of course. Joinville also speaks of Khwarezmian standards, which were, quote, red and indented up towards the lanks, that were probably swallowtail pennants. Then Jan Hit records a type of standard called Tu, which I would actually associate to the Tug, but that is it's very peculiar and specific, because basically it's like it's a standard properly, but it's as if the cloth was made actually of a metal blade, an ornamental metal blade. Actually, it's not a weapon, atop of a wooden shaft, right? And this plate was usually perforated or damascened, often with inscriptions or heraldic devices. This is displayed by the famous Hariri's Makmat manuscript dating to 1237. It has, beautiful depictions of Islamic units and banners. While there is actually there is properly archaeological evidence of Mamluk tools, for example, that are sometimes like properly, let's say, broad, for example, broad bladed spears, but with this actual plate perforated and not having an actual offensive function, right? So I also I'm not aware of the exact symbolism of this type of banner that I've never seen before. Attached could be black with gold band and fringe, while the others could be black, blue, red, or crimson with black or white lettering. And the two is witnessed in both the Sultanate of Rome, Persia, throughout all various dominations, Syria, and Egypt as well. Now, speaking a bit more in detail about the Turkic, more than just Seljuk tradition of banners, the tug, right? Amongst the early Turks, so in pre-Islamic, in the pre-Islamic world in Central Asia, etc., this was an emblem of royal authority. It was either a standard or a drum, or actually probably, as far as I understand, both things combined. So this already acquaints you to the conceptual idea of the symbol of power, not much the fact it was an object, right? We are modern people, we reason like that, but in linear categories, mostly in a scientific sense. These were mental categories that mostly escape our idea of authority, of power, etc. And the standard was used in this sense as a battle flag and as an rallying point on the battlefield. The drum actually had the same rallying function plus the capacity as we've seen to order to give a rhythm, to a pace to the troops to when lining up for battle, all this stuff, right? So it's as if these symbols fundamentally made the command descending literally from heaven, right, and giving victory through those who owned them naturally. So this was the deal. Only certain leaders were worthy of such emblems of power. So therefore, this was a very serious thing. The Tug proper was known from the time of the Turkic or Western Turks in Transoxiana, right, and even of the Uyghurs. And the traditional old Turkish standard was properly a horse's tail, or a bunch of horse hairs on a pole. In the regions of Inner Asia adjacent to Tibet, this could also be the tail of a yak, known as the kutash. And a great ruler would be described as having 9 tugs. That would be the maximum possible. In fact, he would be called the Tokuts Tug Lug Khan at that point, and that was kind of the maximum magnitude of power. There are certain scholars that define the tug also as properly the drum, as we've seen, beaten in the ruler's presence. So what would be later known in Islamic terms, as we've seen in that video, the navba. And such great drums, the kürge, were also used later by the Mongols as rallying points in battle, etc. So in Islamic times, the Seljuks would have an alam proper, so in Arabic properly the flag, that would correspond, as far as I understand, and would be cited, in fact, by the ruler's 9 standards. And this flag would be made of brocade or orange silk. This is important because it's as if this was a further confirmation of the fact that that was the great ruler that had the 9 tugs, right? But the flag traditions would stem from Chinese influence and probably pre-Islamic times proper. Clausen specifically stresses, philologically speaking, that the term tug would be a loan word from the Chinese tu banner, that is actually the one we were looking at before. Linguistically, I don't know how it would be eventually passed, why he says that it was the tu standard. Maybe he's referring actually about the tug, but as we've seen, this this is a bit mixed, because the tuk would be in the Turkic tradition the horse tail, bunch of horsehair on a pole, whereas the one he talks about is this kind of metal plate, fixed on a pole, which is a different thing. It would be closer to the idea of a proper standard, not the tuk proper. So anyhow, when we look at the Middle Chinese term dog, we think also, chronologically speaking, that this borrowing from the side of the Turks might have taken place early in time. Another famous insignium, let's say, of royalty among the Seljuks was the sanjak, that even just, as you know, gave the name, as we will see, to certain historical regions, also in Europe, the sanjakate, etc. Why? Because, as we will see, this insignium fundamentally symbolized a form of higher power properly created, imposed on a certain land, that would be recognized as part of the Seljuk dominion, and the universal symbolism of the Seljuks would make spread this element also among the Ottomans, that in fact would mostly spread the term, as you know, also in Europe. So in the Turkish text of Ibn Bibi, the word sanjak is always found in connection with the title of sultan, Sultanin Sanjaki. Right? I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, because here I see a lot of kind of cities and accents and so on, so I don't know how it is. But the important here is that the sanjak is an emblem of sultanial power, and the standard is mentioned relatively to different sieges of strong places, on the walls of which the sanjak was placed after the capitulation. So there is a strong, markedly territorial character, right, of properly. I don't know whether we can define it through the Turkic Seljuk tradition as an earthly power, but the idea that, yes, the Sultan in this regard, it's more like, as you know what the role of the Seljuks were also relatively to the Caliphate, right? The Caliphate is the Caliph is the greatest authority in the Islamic community, whereas the Sultan is more like of a delegate of his power that, however, owns it from a also military point of view concretely. So the Seljuks were more bloody and earthly, let's say, in this sense, and still having a lot of pagan background. But the important here is that the sanjak reflects a power that is at that point chained, rooted to a single place, and showed at that point when a great strong place was captured. This is important if you consider in Seljuk times there are here we're talking about the 11th and 13th century, so even in the world, we're talking about primitive times, where a stronghold, a castle, an heir could dominate a wide region, and that, the Seljuks expanded dramatically from an extensional point of view. So it would be very important to stress, also in the floating and mostly fluid and unstable Seljuk empire, that as soon as it was created began to fragment, the legitimization of power. So an important ideological statement of, we have conquered this place, and therefore the sanjak embodies the fact that this really belongs to the Sultan. And interestingly enough, sometimes it is the besieged themselves who, ready to surrender, and no doubt seeing in the sanjak the guarantee of protection against pillaging, asked for the standard to be sent. So it has a deeper, also political, communitarian meaning. The idea that if the sanjak is planted, is fixed on this land, the inhabitants of the community is recognized also as a protege of the Sultan. Hence, it cannot be touched, destroyed. As there is an important tension in here between the attempt of creating a more stable power from the side of the sultans and the kind of almost, we can say, anarchic, but still very very autonomously minded, to say the least, even if euphemistically, of all these bands of Central Asian horsemen that absolutely were just there about pillaging and coming and going back and forth and still having a semi-nomadic, if not a fully nomadic lifestyle. Differently from the highly Persified, Seljuks that were trying to create a freaking state, right? Importantly, the Sultan was not necessarily present every time a sanjak was fixed, right? On the contrary, the sanjak could be a symbol of delegation of sultanial power. For example, some historians show how the Beyler Bey set out on expeditions with the standard of the sovereign. So there was a delegation of power. It's like, in Rome, you have the Roman emperor that owns the imperium, and then you have the Roman eagle that embodies that is, in the hands of the legates, of the military commanders at the head of the legions, right? So something similar, at least. And for a long time, the neighboring princes and vassals of the Seljuks respected their privilege, but the Atabeg of Mosul, Saif al-Din al-Ghazi, son of Imad al-Din Zanji, died November 1149, was the first of these representatives to actually have a sanjak carried unfurled over his head, which meant that was specifically a sultanial prerogative. So it's as if the sanjak was, when it was furled, it would still be a form of delegation, but not reflecting those being properly furled, not reflecting those who were carrying them, right? Instead, when it was unfurled, it was because he who was carrying it would assume this kind of sultanial power on his own, in a sense. So through autonomization, these things began to happen. In fact, the Ayyubids followed the example of the Seljuks as well. In 1198 AD, the Sultan of Egypt, al-Malik al-Aziz, conferred on his nephew al-Malik al-Muazzam Isa, when he became Prince of Damascus, so also a decentralized area, by the way, to Egypt in Syria, as the sanjak of the Liwa to display throughout the world. Also in 1250, Aybak the Turkoman, married to an Ayyubid princess and proclaimed Sultan of Egypt, took part in a procession in which the royal banners were unfurled for him, right? So embodying almost himself the sultanial power in that case. What is interesting, and that stresses the importance of Turkic influence in Egypt at this point, is that among the Mamluks there was a distinction made between the sanjakdar, so the royal standard banner, and the ordinary al-Afdal, so the standard bearer, so that the Turkic term was introduced, whereas the alam one, the Arabic one, was the less important in interest of of the actual standard bearer's status, and the distinction would disappear in some less developed areas, like in Turkish Algeria. According to one later Ottoman tradition that hasn't to be taken literally, but nevertheless, the sanjak / banner as a political symbol, right, became one of the insignia of investiture of the Ottoman sultans, right? Notably the first one was properly Ottomanly himself. So the Ottomans fully live in the wake of the Seljuks relatively to the sanjak symbolism. And in 1280, after the capture of Karadia-Hisar by Ottoman Sultan Ala al-Din II, to celebrate this conquest, sent him by the hands of Ak Timur, Ottoman's nephew, sanjak, quote, with its accessories, sanjak yaragi, as Ashik Pasha Zade tells us. This was a later, slightly later source. There's another story that is Nashri that prefers another version, and Ashik Pashadzade mentions in this connection that Ottoman became properly a sanjak bey, and according to the same source, the sanjaks of the Ottomans at this point were made of cloth produced either in Philadelphia or al-Afdal here. Then it's worth to talk a little bit about an important Islamic symbol, that is the crescent, the new moon. That is very important in Islamic law because in the Islamic lunar calendar, it determines, among various things, the date of the pilgrimage and the beginning and the end of the Ramadan. Right? It's a bit like, at the end of the day, the Christians, Easter is calculated with lunar cycles as well. So the new moon is known as the Hilal, which became essentially over the centuries and even before Islam actually, dating from Mesopotamian traditions, a decorative emblem on royal horses. This is true at least since Sasanian times. The Persians had also famously, as also in today's Iran, the symbol of the lion and the sun. That is connected, I presume, in part also to these traditions, surely of Mesopotamian origin. So these are millenary symbols. Let's say the earliest preserved example of the new moon is made of rock crystal, and it bears the name of the Fatimid Caliph al-Zahir li Izzaz din Allah, ruling from 1021-1036, and that it is now preserved at the Germanisches Nationalmuseum of Nuremberg. And the usage of the Hilal continues into Seljuk times, between the 12th and the 13th century, when bronze crescents were decorated with other designs. The Hilal as equine decoration survived as well throughout Ottoman period. There is, for example, one composed of two boar tusks mounted in gold, captured in the Battle of Selanikament in 1691. Then, simply talking and briefly talking of Islamic banners, colors, traditionally, for example, the Umayyads fought under white and gold banners. The color white is often believed to symbolize purity and peace. Many Muslims wear it, for example, during when they attend Friday prayers. The Abbasids instead chose black and or blue, and fought with black banners. And the color black is considered the color of mourning, as in Western Mediterranean countries. However, it is considered also a color of modesty in some Muslim cultures. And the black standard, known as the al-Uqab, the eagle, was called like this because it was pure black, was the Abbasid symbol. It didn't have any symbol or markings. In fact, you see here sometimes indicated there are these full colors, or not. Well, black is not a color technically, but a bit that express the totalizing nature of Islam. And in this, the al-Uqab, the eagle, and with the black color, was derived from the flag of the Quraysh, one of the tribes of Arabia, whose flag was black with an eagle, and was also known, in fact, as the eagle. And so here we date back even to kind of migration era times, where you realize basically any single people around in Europe, the Mediterranean, wherever, had the eagle as a symbol. Everybody, the Romans, the Slavs, the Arabs, it's pretty universal symbology. And in Islam specifically, it's an eschatological color because it basically heralds the advent of the Mahdi, right? So I presume represents this kind of lack of vision before the advent. So express the depth and the darkness of current time, the totalizing drive and weight and, you know, faith that is brought. And these were all military banners too. Well, the color green has a number of traditional associations in Islam. Famously enough, in the Quran, it's associated with paradise, right? This is what the first, you know, Arabs, you know, the time of Muhammad's time would see, like in a world of desert, the green, like the paradise, fertile areas, the grass, and this is something that remained. In fact, in the 12th century, the green was chosen as a dynastic color by the Shiite Fatimids, that in fact had this green background with, I think, a black crescent and star. And in contrast with the black used by the Sunnite Abbasids, so there was a lot of competition in there. That, you know, under the Fatimids, there was enough risk for, you know, for Islam actually to turn Shiite. Right, actually, since the time of Al-Mamun, had sympathies for the Shiites. At some point, you know, Islam could see the prevalence of the Shia. But in Fatimid's time, the power reached by Egypt was meant also to counter proper the Abbasids by emulating them, in part. So, yeah. All right, and I wish I had found actually more information, but I think that's pretty much it. We're not, as far as I understand, dramatically documented on this. I'm sure there are specialistic books on this stuff, but I don't think that from a strictly military point of view we know more than much, at least for this specific period. And I'm sure for the earlier ones also there is more, also naturally in terms of symbolism. That is, at the end of the day, what we are interested in. So for now, we stop here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.